Welcome to a deep dive, into the world of John Milton.
Hmm.
You might know him as the author of Paradise Lost, but did you know he's considered one of the most important figures in English literature,
Yeah.
right up there with Shakespeare? We're going to explore why that is, going beyond the epic poems to uncover his influence on ideas that still resonate today.
Right.
Get ready for rebellious angels, passionate prose, and maybe even a surprising connection to the American Revolution.
It's incredible how deeply Milton's ideas about individual liberty and the struggle against tyranny concepts we grapple with even now
Right.
are rooted in his work.
So, to really understand Milton, we need to start with his place in literary history. What
Sure.
makes him such a giant in the world of letters?
Well, he's not just a poet. He's a master of language who revived classical traditions in a way that hadn't been seen since, well, the classical period.
Wow.
He was swimming against the against the popular metaphysical style of his time.
I can see how that would make him stand out. Was he a rebel from the start?
Absolutely. Born in London, educated at Cambridge, early signs of poetic genius,
Yeah.
all pretty standard for a literary figure of his time.
Yeah.
But then you add in the English Civil Wars and his Puritan beliefs, and you have the recipe for a truly revolutionary figure.
Yeah.
Milton wasn't just writing about change, he was actively fighting for it.
It's fascinating how his personal life and beliefs so clearly fueled his work. So, this fiery spirit, this passion for change, where do we see it most clearly?
Hmm. His most famous work, Paradise Lost, is a great example.
Yeah, okay.
While it's a biblical story, it's also deeply intertwined with the political and religious turmoil of his time.
Okay, we have to talk about Paradise Lost. It's an epic poem, literally over 10,000 lines. What's it all about?
Imagine this. Satan passed out of heaven is rebelling against God. He tempts Adam and Eve, leading to their fall of more grace.
Right.
And while God's justice ultimately prevails, Milton's portrayal of Satan is so complex and compelling that many readers find themselves sympathizing with the devil.
It's interesting how Milton makes us sympathize with the devil, isn't it? What do you think is behind that?
Well, Milton doesn't shy away from nuance. He gives Satan some of the best lines in the poem, imbuing him with charisma and a sense of righteous anger that resonates with anyone who's ever felt like an outsider or a rebel.
But Paradise Lost is just one side of the coin, right? He also wrote Paradise Regained.
Right.
How does that fit in?
It offers a counterpoint.
Yeah.
Paradise Regained focuses on Christ's resistance to temptation, showcasing a quieter kind of strength. And stylistically, it's a departure from the grandeur of Paradise Lost, much more restrained and introspective.
He wasn't afraid to experiment with different forms and styles. Didn't he also write a play based on a biblical story?
He did. Samson Agonistes is a tragedy written in the style of the ancient Greeks that tells the story of Samson the strong man betrayed by Delilah.
Right.
Some scholars even suggest that Milton wrote it to inspire the defeated Puritans after the restoration of the monarchy.
Hmm.
Samson, stripped of his power, still finds the strength to defy his captors.
So you're telling me that even someone who had experienced defeat in his own political life was still searching for ways to inspire hope.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But, Milton wasn't just interested in biblical stories. He was also deeply engaged in the issues of his day. He
Right.
was talking about freedom of speech, divorce, religious tolerance. These were radical ideas at the time, and he wrote fiercely and passionately about them in his prose works.
I love the idea that he didn't just write poetry. He was out there engaging with the world, trying to make a difference. Was his prose just as powerful as his poetry?
It was, though, in a different way. His prose is fiery and direct,
Yeah.
almost like he's arguing with you face to face. One source described him as being always on the side of liberty, whether it is religious or civil.
That's such a great quote and so relevant today. You can almost see the seeds of the American Revolution being planted right there in his words. So we have the poet, the revolutionary, the champion of liberty. But how did his work, especially Paradise Lost, impact the literary world after he was gone?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Paradise Lost had a ripple effect that continued for centuries, influencing writers in ways you might not expect. We'll dive into all that right after.
Hmm.
Paradise Lost had a ripple effect that continued for centuries, influencing writers in ways you might not expect. It wasn't just admired for its poetry, it was adapted, reimagined, and even turned into an opera.
An opera? That's unexpected who would take on a 10,000 line poem and set it to music.
Well, none other than John Dryden, a prominent poet of the time. He actually consulted with Milton before publishing The State of Innocence and Fall of Man in 1677. It seems it never actually made it to the stage, though.
What a shame. It would have been quite a spectacle, but even without the operatic adaptation, Paradise Lost had a major impact, didn't it? What resonated with audiences back then?
By the late 1600s, it was already a widely admired work, and in the 18th century, during the Age's Enlightenment, it was praised for its grand scope, and intellectual depth thinkers like Joseph Addison, a prominent essayist, even compared it to the great epics of classical antiquity.
So Milton's revival of classical traditions really paid off. He was ahead of his time in a way. But how did Paradise Lost fare during the neoclassical movement? That period was all about heroic couplets and structured verse quite different from Milton's blank verse.
Interestingly, Paradise Lost was seen as a magnificent exception to the neoclassical rules because of its unique use of blank verse and its biblical subject matter. Even Alexander Pope, a champion of the neoclassical style, drew inspiration from it for his mock epic, The Rape of the Lock. He couldn't deny the power of Milton's work, even if it didn't fit neatly into the prevailing aesthetic.
So even those who were pushing for a different style couldn't escape Milton's influence. Were there any critics who weren't as impressed?
There were dissenting voices, of course. Samuel Johnson, a renowned critic, while acknowledging the sublimity of Paradise Lost, took issue with some of Milton's descriptions of nature.
Mm.
He felt they lacked authenticity, suggesting Milton relied more on books than real-life observation.
That's an interesting point. Milton was known for his vast scholarship, so maybe Johnson had a point there. But even with those criticisms, Milton's reputation remained strong, right?
For the most part, yes. And then came the Romantic era, and Paradise Lost found a whole new generation of fans, particularly among poets like William Blake, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron.
Now, those are some heavy hitters in the world of poetry. What was it about Milton that appealed to the Romantics? They seem so different from the Enlightenment thinkers who praised Paradise Lost for its intellect.
Well, the Romantics saw in Paradise Lost a reflection of their own rebellious spirit. They were drawn to Satan's character, interpreting him as a heroic figure fighting against tyranny. This interpretation was quite different from earlier readings, but it resonated with the Romantics' own challenges to the status quo.
So Milton, the revolutionary writer, found a new audience in the Romantic poets who were also pushing boundaries and challenging authority. How fascinating. Did this renewed interest in Milton continue into the 20th century?
It's a mixed bag. While there were scholars and critics who championed his work there were also those who found his style too archaic and distant from the modern sensibility. T.S. Eliot, a giant of modernist poetry, expressed some reservations about Milton's epic verse, finding the language too stiff and complex. He even suggested that Milton's influence had been detrimental to English poetry, hindering the development of a more natural and conversational style.
So even a literary giant like Milton wasn't immune to criticism, it seems. Every generation rediscovers and reinterprets the classics in their own way.
That's the beauty of literature. It's a living conversation that spans centuries. What speaks to one era might fall flat in another. But the great works like those of Milton have a way of enduring, even if their interpretation evolves over time, which brings us to the present day.
Exactly. After this whirlwind tour through literary history, we're back to where we started, with you and the legacy of John Milton. What do you think? How do his ideas still resonate with us today?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think there are certain themes in Milton's work that remain eternally relevant. The struggle against tyranny, the search for meaning and purpose, the power of language to inspire and provoke. These are ideas that continue to shape our world, but what strikes you is most relevant.
Well, going back to Paradise Lost for a moment, you mentioned how some readers find themselves sympathizing with Satan. I have to admit, I find myself drawn to his rebellious spirit, even though I know he's supposed to be the villain.
It's a testament to Milton's skill as a writer that he created such a complex character. He didn't present a black and white morality tale. He gave us characters who are both flawed and fascinating, forcing us to confront our own assumptions about good and evil. And that's something that continues to resonate with readers today. We're still drawn to stories that challenge our perspectives and make us question the easy answers.
So we've gone beyond Paradise Lost and seen the full scope of Milton's genius. Poet revolutionary and champion of liberty. His impact on literature and thought is undeniable, and while some of his ideas might seem archaic today, there's a timelessness to his exploration of human nature and the struggle for freedom. It's been an incredible journey exploring the world of John Milton.
Indeed, and I hope this deep dive has inspired you to delve deeper into his works and discover your own interpretations of this complex and enduring writer.
Because ultimately, that's what great literature does, right? It sparks conversations that continue long after the final page is turned.
Exactly. So what are your final thoughts? Does Satan deserve our sympathy? How do Milton's ideas still speak to us today?
Those are great questions to ponder. It's amazing to think that a writer from the 17th century can still provoke such deep thought and discussion.
And that's the power of John Milton.
It really is remarkable how relevant Milton remains even centuries later. It's like we've been on this whirlwind tour of his work, and every step of the way we bump into ideas that are still shaping our world. Freedom of speech, the power of the individual, the struggle against oppression, it's all there in Milton.
It's true. And what's so fascinating is how he manages to weave these big ideas into compelling stories, whether it's the epic scope of Paradise Lost or the personal tragedy of
Mhm.
Samson Agonistes. He understood that stories are a powerful way to engage with these complex issues.
And that's what makes him so much more than just a poet. He was a thinker, a revolutionary, and a master storyteller all rolled into one. But for you, what's the most enduring aspect of Milton's work? What will people still be talking about centuries from now?
That's a tough question. But I think it's his unwavering belief in the power of the individual. Whether it's Satan rebelling against God or Samson defying his captors,
Yeah.
Milton's characters constantly challenge authority and fight for their own agency. And in a world where individual voices are often drowned out by the noise, that message continues to resonate.
I think you're right. There's something so inspiring about that. Even when his characters are flawed, even when they make mistakes, they never give up on their right to think for themselves and fight for what they believe in. And that's a powerful message for any age.
Exactly. And it's a message that you can find throughout his work, not just in his poetry, but in his prose, too. He argued passionately for individual liberties, for the right to dissent, for the freedom to challenge the status quo. He reminds us that these rights are hard-won and must be constantly defended.
It's like he's speaking directly to us across the centuries, urging us to be engaged citizens, to never take our freedoms for granted. It's incredible to think that one writer can have such a lasting impact.
It is, and while his language might feel a bit archaic at times, the ideas are as fresh and relevant as ever. He pushes us to think critically, to question authority, and to never stop fighting for a better world.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of John Milton, I have to ask, what's your biggest takeaway? What will you be mulling over?
For me, it's the reminder that literature can be a powerful force for change. Milton's work isn't just about beautiful language or compelling stories. It's about ideas that have shaped our world and continue to challenge us to think deeply about who we are and what we stand for.
I couldn't agree more. And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the depth and breadth of John Milton's genius. He's so much more than just the author of Paradise Lost. He's a voice that speaks across centuries, reminding us of the power of words, the importance of individual liberty, and the enduring struggle for a just and equitable world.
So keep exploring Milton's work. Dive deeper into his poetry and prose, and most importantly, keep asking the big questions, because as Milton himself reminds us, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven.
What a powerful thought to leave us with. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep diving deep.